All right, let's jump straight into this explainer. Today, we're connecting the dots between high-stakes geopolitical trade wars in Washington and, well, a literal mountain of municipal solid waste in Ontario. It is a fascinating story of how abstract international tariffs can trigger a very physical, very immediate crisis right in our own backyards. Basically, we're looking at the domino effect of the 2025 and 2026 trade wars and how they threaten to completely choke the vital Ontario-Michigan waste corridor. Basically, we're looking at the domino effect of the 2025 and 2026 trade wars and how they threaten to completely choke the vital Ontario-Michigan waste corridor. Now, the sheer scale of this issue is absolutely massive. Just look at this number. According to recent waste reports, out of the 16.88 million tons of waste Ontario generated in 2024, 12.75 million tons ended up being landfilled. And of that landfilled amount, a staggering 27%, which is roughly 3.44 million tons, was exported straight across the U.S. border. We are talking about millions of tons of commercial, industrial, and construction waste being loaded onto trucks every single year heading south, primarily into Michigan. So we have a lot of ground to cover today, moving from the macroeconomics of international tariffs to the hyperlocal realities of waste management. Here is our roadmap. We'll start with the transboundary waste corridor, look at the shock of the 2025 trade war, analyze Ontario's looming landfill crisis, discuss the resulting political panic, and finally wrap up with how the industry is building domestic resilience. Okay, Section 1, the transboundary waste corridor. Let's see how this fragile interdependence between Ontario and Michigan was actually built. This chart really puts things into perspective. Look at how reliant the system is on that border. Canadian garbage currently accounts for nearly 15% of all the solid waste dumped into Michigan landfills. Now, it's worth noting that major Ontario municipalities actually stopped shipping their household waste stateside way back in 2010. But commercial and industrial businesses, they've kept this corridor absolutely booming, with annual shipments surging over the last decade. So why Michigan, right? Well, it all comes down to basic economics. Michigan's historically low 36-cent state fee created this massive incentive for Ontario waste managers. Honestly, it was simply much cheaper to put trash on a truck and send it south. But as you can imagine, this massive influx created some real political friction. That 36-cent incentive is something Governor Gretchen Whitmer explicitly targeted. She proposed hiking it to $5 a ton just to bring fees in line with regional averages, and quite frankly, to stop out-of-state and Canadian trash from filling up their landfills. Which begs the question, what exactly is in those trucks crossing the border? You'd think it's all just true garbage, but it isn't. As we see here, 38% is organic, 26% is curbside recyclable plastics and metals, and another 20% consists of other recyclables. Only 16% of this exported waste truly belongs in a landfill. The vast majority of it could actually be diverted if the infrastructure and economic incentives existed back home in Ontario. Moving on to Section 2, the 2025 trade war. What happens when that established, heavily utilized waste corridor gets caught in the crosshairs of an international trade dispute? If we follow this timeline, things escalated incredibly fast. In February 2025, President Donald Trump signed executive orders imposing harsh 25% tariffs on Canada. Boom! Just like that, decades of seamless North American supply chain integration were thrown into sudden jeopardy. And even with big political shifts up in Canada, like the election of Mark Carney as Prime Minister in May 2025, the trade uncertainty and these looming threats to the CUSMA trade agreement have stubbornly persisted well into 2026. Now, to give context on the U.S. side, the administration framed these tariffs as a necessary response to border security and transboundary drug smuggling concerns, specifically regarding fentanyl. But here is the catch. The ripple effects were totally indiscriminate. They immediately struck industries that had absolutely nothing to do with those issues, like commercial waste export. The stable trade that flowed north and south for decades was suddenly viewed as a liability, putting the cross-border trash trade on very, very thin ice. And that brings us back north of the border for Section 3, Ontario's looming landfill crisis. Because this abstract international trade policy just triggered a very real domestic panic. This quote from Ontario Premier Doug Ford really hits the nail on the head. It captures the sheer political and logistical anxiety rippling through the province. What do we do? A tariff signed down in Washington suddenly forced Ontario's leaders to face a terrifying reality. If the border gets choked off by these trade disputes, they might literally run out of places to put their own garbage.
And when you look at the data, you can see exactly why Environment Minister Todd McCarthy was sounding the alarm. Ontario only has about 125.61 million tons of approved landfill capacity remaining. Where still, 57% of that is concentrated in just 7 sites. Because the system has relied so heavily on using the US as a release valve, experts are warning that without it, Ontario could completely run out of landfill space in just 9 years. 9 years!
Faced with this massive bottleneck, the Ontario government had to act, and they had to act quickly. Let's look at Section 4, Political Panic and Solutions. So let's dive into the controversial solution the province deployed. In June 2025, they passed an omnibus bill known as Bill 5. This legislation specifically named the York One Waste facility in the small community of Dresden. And get this, it explicitly exempted the site from standard environmental assessments. This was a clear, aggressive move to fast-track domestic landfill capacity, despite local pushback, directly in response to the vulnerability exposed by the border crisis. And to understand the scale of this, the York One expansion is multiplying its footprint exponentially, growing from a tiny processing site of under 1 hectare to a massive 25-hectare domestic hub. It perfectly highlights just how desperate the province is to find a home for those millions of tons that were previously bound for Michigan. It's a massive pivot, happening at lightning speed. But to be fair, York One isn't just planning a traditional dump. They are building out some pretty robust capabilities to process construction waste and actually recover materials. By adding indoor sorting, manufacturing alternative low-carbon fuels, and even installing soil washing systems to recover aggregate, they are making a real attempt to squeeze more value out of the waste. The goal is to divert as much as humanly possible before it takes up that precious, incredibly limited domestic landfill space. Which leads us to our final part, Section 5, Building Domestic Resilience. Because beyond just fast-tracking landfills, this whole tariff shock has forced the industry to look inward at high-tech solutions. Simply put, to avoid sending everything to a hole in the ground, massive new investments are pouring into advanced infrastructure. For instance, we're seeing the deployment of new 160,000 metric ton automated facilities right in Ontario. These plants are utilizing artificial intelligence and advanced optical sorting to drastically improve recycling efficiency. It's the kind of tech needed to handle the massive volumes that just can't easily flow into the United States anymore. And we're also seeing some truly incredible localized innovations. For example, researchers at Western University and Fanshawe College in London, Ontario, are literally baking old clothes to solve a major waste problem. They use a process called pyrolysis, which applies extreme heat in the absence of oxygen to break down discarded textiles and transform them into a charcoal-like product called biochar. The crucial takeaway here is that by turning problematic textile waste into what is essentially agricultural gold, they are simultaneously easing landfill pressure and creating a highly valuable domestic product. Biochar improves crop growth and helps soil retain water. Honestly, it's a perfect example of a circular economy solution that is totally 100% immune to cross-border tariffs and trade wars. Ultimately, this entire crisis forces us to look in the mirror and ask a very uncomfortable question about our fragile, interconnected supply chains. We tend to take for granted that our waste just disappears. But if the borders suddenly lock down and the geopolitical dominoes fall against us, are we prepared to live with what we throw away? It's a massive wake-up call for building real, sustainable capacity right here at home. Thanks for joining me on this explainer. I hope it helps shed some light on the hidden, everyday complexities of our waste streams.